This is going to be a spoiler-free, well, mostly spoiler-free reaction to The Suicide Squad, the new movie by James Gunn, and not a full review. I will be doing a spoiler-filled discussion of the film with my friend Deej Odyssey on Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. While, like I said, this will not be a spoiler review of the film, there will be one minor spoiler of an event that takes place at the beginning of the film, and another minor spoiler of an event that takes place midway through the film, but no major plot points will be revealed. The Suicide Squad is the third major motion picture to feature Margot Robbie's rendition of Harley Quinn, and interestingly enough, a pattern emerges. After watching Suicide Squad, Birds of Prey, and now The Suicide Squad, first, of the three films that feature Harley Quinn, this one by far shows her the least. Second, that of the three films, this one is by far the best. And third, those last two facts are in direct proportion to each other. And I believe that there is in fact causation in those facts. I do believe there is in fact causation in the fact that the less amount of Harley Quinn that you have in a film involving the DCEU, the better by contrast that film is. In fact, I would dare say that the best way to make a Suicide Squad movie moving forward would be to exclude Harley Quinn from the film entirely. That is not to say that I dislike the character of Harley Quinn. Quite the contrary. In Batman the Animated Series, and later on in the animated series called The Batman, I found Harley to be an interesting companion character to the Joker. And in fact, she actually has a couple of solo adventures and adventures in which she teams up with Poison Ivy that I also found quite compelling. However, I just happen to not like Margot Robbie's version of Harley. My understanding is that Margot Robbie's interpretation of the character is not based on what we see in the animated shows, which was really the origin of Harley Quinn, but really more based on some of her later comic book stories, which is more of a hypersexualized character and has very little to do with an actual Harlequin. I frankly find this new interpretation of Harley Quinn to be vulgar, gratuitous, and distasteful. But then I am old. I do understand that those of a younger generation may find a character like this much more stimulating, as she does provide simple visual stimulus. However, I prefer characters that are interesting and provide some kind of intellectual stimulus rather than something that is simply pleasing to the eye if you happen to find Margot Robbie attractive. All in all, I think that Suicide Squad is a marked improvement in the DCEU's team of misfits that is not the main team of the DCEU. You know, kind of the DCEU's version of Guardians of the Galaxy. So it should be no surprise that it was James Gunn, the writer and director of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1 and 2, that managed to salvage this franchise. James Gunn was clearly the right man for the job as for trying to save the Suicide Squad franchise. He toned down Harley Quinn a lot for this film, and he brought in some interesting new characters, including the surprise standout of Polka Dot Man, King Shark, who I was also surprised was a very fun character and very well voice acted by Sylvester Stallone, as well as John Cena as Peacemaker, a rather psychotic version of Captain America, incredible Idris Elba as Bloodsport, a somewhat obvious stand-in for Will Smith, but a welcome one. There are other interesting and really well done supporting characters in the film, but I don't want to discuss every supporting character because, quite frankly, to list them all would in and of itself be a spoiler, because there are a lot of supporting characters that we're introduced to at the beginning of the film, and to learn who lives and who dies too early would in and of itself be a major spoiler and ruin a lot of fun from the beginning of the film. So I don't want to ruin what is one of the most entertaining sequences of the beginning of the film. Every supporting character in the film, with the exception of Harley Quinn, feels like they organically belong there. They feel like there's a reason for them to be there, and you genuinely care about them by the end of the film. So props to James Gunn for once again assembling a team of misfits that we can genuinely care about and hope to see sequels to come. Now, I do want to talk about one element of this film in particular that I find absolutely hilarious, and actually something that I think is kind of funny that not a lot of people are talking about. I mentioned it on a live stream, but so far I haven't seen anybody else really talking about this, and I'm really, really surprised. It does seem like everybody, for the most part, is embracing this film, both critics and audiences. As of this writing, it has a 92% score on Rotten Tomatoes from critics and an 87% score from the fans. So it seems like it's a pretty safe bet that both the critics and the fans seem to like the film, as far as those that respond to aggregate sites like Rotten Tomatoes. And so it would seem that the very people who really, really hated James Gunn just a couple of years ago didn't get the secret message that is hidden within the film that was directed right at them. And in fact, you could argue that the entire film is nothing but a huge, well, middle finger pointed directly at the cancel culture that really was aimed at Mr. Gunn just a few years ago. And, well, for those of you that don't remember, Mr. Gunn got himself in a little bit of hot water a few years ago. Now, James Gunn didn't himself do anything just a few years ago. What happened was he told some very off-color jokes a long time ago on Twitter, and these jokes involved children, and they were very distasteful. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not defending the jokes he said. I think they were extremely distasteful. I also don't think that it is against the law to tell off-color jokes. So, all that being said, some people saw these jokes that he had posted on Twitter a very long time ago and demanded that Disney fire him from being one of their premier directors. And so Disney actually did pressure Marvel to get rid of him, and they did do so. And quite frankly, a lot of people were very upset about this. I was among them. I didn't think that he deserved to get fired for something that he did before he was hired by Disney in the first place, because he did post these off-color remarks before he was hired to do the Guardians of the Galaxy. And so I thought it was wrong, because he was hired, he told these jokes, then he was hired, then they found out about the jokes, so then they fired him. I thought that was just, and it's not like he, it was just wrong. So then eventually, while he was on this hiatus from Disney, Warner Brothers took advantage of the situation and hired him to make this movie, to make the Suicide Squad. So the only reason we have the Suicide Squad is because of this cancel culture movement that got him fired from making Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. And so while he was making the Suicide Squad, Disney realized their mistake, and so they hired him back. And so now at this moment, he is currently working on Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. And so he is back with Marvel. However, this movie is now coming out, and this movie is actually, like I said, a gigantic middle finger aimed right at those people. So you may be asking, well, what is the giant middle finger aimed at the cancel culture of Twitter? Well, I'll tell you. In the opening scenes of this film, we meet a character named Savant, played by Michael Rooker. Michael Rooker is, in fact, a good friend of James Gunn. And I have a feeling, I don't know this for sure, but I just have a feeling that Michael Rooker probably wanted to play this part specifically because of the fact that Michael Rooker is such a good friend of James. And the cancel culture went after Michael Rooker because of him playing this part. And in fact, if they were even successful in ending his career, I think that Rooker probably is the kind of guy with enough integrity to figure that, hey, his friendship with James Gunn was worth his career. And so, now, I don't have anything to base this on other than just a simple gut feeling. Michael Rooker, in the opening scene of this film, we see him, he's sitting in his jail cell. Now, we know what's going to happen. He's going to be offered to have time off of his sentence, to work with Waller and join the Suicide Squad. And so but before that happens, we see him looking around his cell, and he just happens to see a little bird that happens to look an awful lot like a similar little bird that we've seen all over the internet for a long, long time. It just happens to look like the logo of a certain internet company. And let's just say that that bird meets a very untimely end rather suddenly, and then ends up a smear on Michael Rooker's pants. Not particularly pleasant. And not only that, I will say, as bad as that scene is, that's not the only bird we see in this movie. And in fact, this movie has a ton of birds in it. And in fact, and I'm not lying here. We were watching this movie, and the missus actually said to me midway through this movie, "Hey, you know, this movie is a lot better than the first Suicide Squad movie, but I really don't understand why they're killing so many birds in this movie. You could do a drinking game for the number of birds they brutally kill in this movie." And in fact, there's one scene where they kill an entire flock of parrots with a can of gasoline. I am not kidding. An evil general actually decides to burn an entire flock of parrots just because he's evil. Not only that, now much of this movie takes place in the fictional country of Corto Maltese. If that sounds familiar, it's because it is a very commonly used fictional country in the DC universe. It's where all sorts of bad things tend to happen in DC, including where the nuclear strike was heading in the very famous Dark Knight Returns story. Well, this is where the Suicide Squad was sent and where most of the action goes down. And while they're in Corto Maltese, when they're ordered to leave at the end, some bad stuff is still happening, but the Suicide Squad decides to disobey orders and risk getting their heads blown off. Why? To save the children. Not only that, one of the characters decides to go rogue to expose horrible government cover-ups. Why? Because of what happened to children. And in fact, children is like birds are brutalized throughout the film, and saving children and preventing the abuse of children is another theme that is run throughout this entire film. And why? Because the horrible jokes that got cancel culture set on Gunn in the first place was him making jokes about kids. So what ended up happening was that he decided when he was making this movie to turn the entire movie into a very subtle and very clever message right back at the cancel culture people, where he's stomping all over the Twitter logo left and right and saying he does indeed care about children. And I absolutely love the way that James Gunn did that. So, you know, I gotta tip my hat. The entire film was James Gunn saying to a few cancel culture people that you couldn't take a joke a few years ago. And I say, hey, James Gunn, you may not be a perfect individual, and you may have told some pretty darn tasteless jokes that I will not even begin to attempt to defend right now. But man, you've got a wicked sense of humor, and if nothing else, you certainly improved the DCEU with this film. Take care. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, please click that thumbs up button and tell a friend so we can beat that algorithm. Leave me a comment if you can think of a great way for me to improve my content. And hey, if you really like what you see, consider going on over to patreon.com and lending us a hand. Every little bit helps. Remember, you are the salt of the earth, but I am the salty trekker. Take care.